The sun is a merciless god in this part of the territory, a brassy eye in a bleached blue sky that offers no shade and no salvation. Eleanor shields her own eyes, her hand a frail visor against the glare. She is 7 months gone with child, a swollen and slow-moving creature in a landscape built for the lean and the quick. Dust coats the back of her throat. It's a constant companion, a gritty reminder of every dry creek bed and withered patch of grama grass between her homestead and the distant, hazy mountains. It is the silence, however, that is most unnerving today. Not the usual quiet of an isolated life, punctuated by the buzz of a fly or the scuttling of a lizard. This is a dead silence, a hell-breath silence. It's what sends her out of the cabin, one hand resting protectively on the taut drum of her belly, the other holding a water bucket that she's forgotten she's carrying. Then she hears it, a sound so thin it might be the wind whistling through a crack in the world. A mewling, a weak, desperate cry that is swallowed almost immediately by the vast, indifferent emptiness. She freezes, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. Every story her husband, Thomas, ever told her, every grim warning from the man at the supply post, rushes into her mind. Varmints, coyotes luring you out. Worse, but this is not the cry of a predator or its bait. It's the sound of pure misery, and it is small. Human small. She follows the sound, her boots sinking into the parched earth, her calico dress clinging to her sweat-damp skin. It leads her to a shallow arroyo, a jagged scar in the land carved by a ghost of a river. There, sheltered by a skeletal overhang of rock, she finds its source. A woman lies on her side, still and silent, her dark hair fanned out in the dust. Her deerskin dress is simple, her face turned away, but Eleanor needs no closer look to know the truth. She is Apache, and the profound stillness about her is that of death. But nestled against the cold curve of the woman's back, wrapped in a bundle of rabbit fur, and strapped to an intricately beaded cradleboard, is life. A baby. Its face is wrinkled and red, its tiny mouth open in a soundless wail of hunger and fear. Its dark eyes, impossibly deep, find hers. The world narrows to that single point, the living and the dead, bracketed by a merciless sun. Her own child gives a sharp kick, a sudden, insistent flutter from within. A life she is sworn to protect. And here is another, helpless, alone, its mother gone, its tribe nowhere in sight. Leaving it is a death sentence. Taking it is something else entirely. It is an act of war, an act of theft, an invitation for a vengeance so terrible she can scarcely imagine it. The warnings of the cavalry lieutenant echo in her ears. They don't ask questions, ma'am, but the baby's cry, now just a weak whimper, cuts through the fear. It is not the cry of an enemy. It is the cry of an orphan. Her hand, trembling, reaches out. She unlatches the cradleboard, her fingers fumbling with the leather ties. The baby is so light. She tucks the small, warm bundle into the fold of her apron, hiding it against her own swollen form. It is a desperate, foolish maternal instinct. And with that one act of mercy, she has claimed a life and perhaps forfeited her own. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The baby is still tucked inside her apron when she gets back to the cabin, its small weight a terrifying, precious secret against her skin. She lays the infant on her own rope bed, the beaded cradleboard placed reverently beside it. The silence of the cabin, once a lonely comfort, now feels charged with conspiracy. Every creak of the floorboards sounds like an accusation. Eleanor had been alone for 3 months. Thomas, her husband, was a man of quiet determination and boundless optimism, qualities that had seemed heroic when he'd spoken of building a life for them out west, but which now felt like a curse. He had taken their 2 best horses and the bulk of their savings to join a cattle drive heading for the Kansas railheads. "It's the only way, Elle," he'd said, his hands cupping her face his gaze earnest. One good season, one big sale, and we'll have enough to buy proper breeding stock to put in a real well. We'll be set. You'll have a proper home to bring our son into. He hadn't known it would be his son. He just said it with the same conviction he said everything. She had believed him, had kissed his dusty cheek, and waved until his wagon was a disappearing speck on the horizon. Now, his absence was a hollow ache in the center of her chest. Their homestead was little more than a one-room sod cabin and a leaning barn, set in 160 acres of hope and baked dirt. It was 5 miles to their nearest neighbor, the Gables, and another 15 to the dusty collection of buildings that called itself the town of redemption. Isolation was the price of their dream. She looked from her own protruding belly to the tiny, dark-skinned baby on her bed. The infant had stopped crying, its eyes following her movements with a solemn, ancient wisdom. She touched its cheek, marveling at the softness of its skin. This child was not some savage caricature from the tales told in town. This was a person perfectly formed, exquisitely alive. The cradleboard was a work of art. The wooden frame was laced with supple hide, and the buckskin covering was adorned with patterns of dyed porcupine quills and beads of turquoise and bone. It spoke of hours of patient, loving work. It spoke of a mother who had cherished this child, who had dreamed for it, just as Eleanor dreamed for her own. She traced the geometric patterns with her finger. This was a chief's son, or something close to it. The quality was unmistakable, and with that thought, a cold dread, deeper than any she had felt before, settled into her bones. This was not a child who would be forgotten. This was a child who would be sought. The stories about the Apache were terrifying. They were spoken of as ghosts of the mountains, capable of appearing and disappearing at will, masters of a brutal, unforgiving warfare. Recently, the talk in redemption had been of a particular leader, a Chiricahua war chief the Mexicans had named Teo, the vulture, for the way he circled his prey before striking. The American soldiers, with their usual lack of imagination, simply called him Cochise, or something like it. They said he was leading a campaign of fire and blood, retaliating for some broken treaty or murdered kin. The truth of it was as hazy as the dust storms, but the fear was sharp and clear. Last month, a patrol of cavalry had stopped at the homestead for water. The young lieutenant, his face burned raw by the sun, had looked at her pregnant state with a mixture of pity and disapproval. "It's no place for a woman alone, ma'am," he'd said, his eyes scanning the empty horizon as if he expected warriors to materialize from the heat shimmer. "There's been trouble up north. Teo's band. They hit a mining camp. Left no one alive. We think they're moving south," he'd lowered his voice. "Word is, they're not just raiding. They're looking for something. Or someone. If you see anything, ma'am, anything out of the ordinary, you don't hesitate. You understand?" She had understood. She had nodded, offered them the last of her coffee, and felt a profound relief when their dust had settled. Now, his words were a brand on her mind. They're looking for someone. The baby began to fuss, a prelude to a cry. Panic seized Eleanor. She had to keep it quiet. What did she feed it? They had no goat, only the scrawny chickens that pecked in the yard and the old milk cow, Bessie, who had gone dry weeks ago. She thought desperately. Cornmeal. She could make a thin gruel, water it down. It would have to do. As she worked, mixing the coarse meal with precious water from the barrel, she felt a change in herself. The initial shock was giving way to a grim, fierce practicality. The baby was her responsibility now. A secret she had to keep from the world. A secret she had to keep alive. She named him, in her mind, Sparrow, for the way he had been left and for the fragility of his life. It was a soft, gentle name, a shield against the harshness of the world that would want him dead. That evening, as the sun bled across the western sky, she sat in the rocking chair Thomas had made for her, feeding the Apache infant with a rag soaked in thin, sweetened gruel. His tiny hands gripped her finger, and for a fleeting moment, the immense, terrifying weight of her decision felt less like a burden and more like a purpose. The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety and furtive care. Eleanor's life, already circumscribed by her pregnancy and isolation, shrank to the four walls of the cabin and the needs of the tiny being within them. Sparrow, as she now called him exclusively in her thoughts, was a demanding charge. His cries, though weak, seemed to echo for miles in the stillness of the plains, each one sending a jolt of pure terror through her. She learned to anticipate his needs, to recognize the subtle shift in his breathing that preceded a wail of hunger, the fretful squirming that meant he needed to be changed. Her solution for his food was a desperate concoction of cornmeal gruel, a little sugar, and a precious few drops of canned milk from her dwindling stores, all watered down until it was a thin, bluish liquid. She fed it to him from a strip of clean linen, squeezing the liquid into his eager mouth. It was a poor substitute for a mother's milk, and she watched him constantly for any sign of sickness, her heart lurching at every cough or sneeze. One afternoon, just as she was rocking him to sleep, she heard the unmistakable sound of a wagon. Her blood ran cold. It could only be the Gables. Martha Gable was a sharp-eyed woman whose piety was matched only by her curiosity. She considered it her Christian duty to check on the poor, abandoned Mrs. Miller, a duty she performed with the intrusive zeal of a government inspector. Panic flared. The cradleboard. It was leaning against the wall by the hearth. The damp cloth she used for Sparrow were drying on a stool. The whole cabin smelled faintly of baby. She moved with a speed that belied her condition. She shoved the cloths under her mattress, grabbed the cradleboard, and thrust it deep into the dark space beneath the rope bed. Then she swaddled Sparrow tightly, praying he would stay silent, and laid him in the wooden crate that served as her sewing box, piling quilts on top, leaving only a tiny gap for air. She straightened her apron, took a deep breath to steady her hammering heart, and opened the door just as Martha Gable was raising a hand to knock. "Eleanor, dear." Martha's voice was as sharp as her gaze, which swept the cabin's interior in a single, comprehensive glance. "I was just telling Mr. Gable. It's been over a week. We had to be sure you were still among the living." "I'm fine, Martha. Just tired," Eleanor said, forcing a smile and blocking the doorway slightly. "Tired is one word for it. You look haggard, child. Are you eating properly?" She pushed past Eleanor into the room. "Land's sakes, it's stuffy in here. A body can't breathe." She made for the window, and Eleanor's heart stopped. The sewing crate was right beside it. I had a chill earlier," Eleanor stammered, moving to intercept her. "The wind picks up something awful in the afternoons." Martha stopped, her eyes narrowing. "A chill? In this heat? You're not coming down with a fever, are you? A woman in your condition can't be too careful." Her gaze landed on the rocking chair, which was still gently moving from Eleanor's hasty departure. Then it drifted to the small pot of cornmeal gruel cooling on the hearth. It was far too thin for an adult to eat. "Just making myself some porridge," Eleanor said quickly, moving to stand in front of the pot. "My stomach has been a little delicate." Martha Gable was not a fool. She saw the rocking chair, the thin gruel, the younger woman's frantic nervousness. But she drew the wrong conclusion. Her expression softened from suspicion to a kind of pitying condescension. "Oh, you poor dear," she clucked, reaching out to pat Eleanor's arm. "It's the loneliness getting to you. Rocking an empty chair. Talking to yourself, I imagine. It's no wonder. It's not natural for a woman to be so alone at a time like this. Thomas should be horsewhipped for leaving you." Relief, so potent it was nauseating, washed over Eleanor. She allowed Martha to fuss over her, to offer unwanted advice and grim predictions about childbirth on the frontier. The entire time, Eleanor's senses were stretched to a breaking point, listening for a single sound from the sewing crate. But Sparrow remained silent. It was a miracle. When Martha finally left, promising to return soon with a jug of buttermilk and a Bible tract on the evils of solitude, Eleanor leaned against the closed door, her legs trembling. She rushed to the crate and lifted the quilts. Sparrow was awake, his dark eyes blinking in the sudden light, but he was calm. He hadn't made a sound. She lifted him, holding him so tightly she was afraid she might hurt him. He had been her conspirator. In that moment of shared, silent deception. The bond between them deepened from one of duty and pity to something fierce and protective. He was no longer just a secret. He was her secret. He was her son, in all but blood. The close call had not warned her off. It had forged her resolve into steel. She would not fail him. The weeks that followed settled into a precarious routine, a quiet dance of survival and secrecy. Eleanor's world became a tapestry woven with two distinct threads: the slow, heavy reality of her own advancing pregnancy, and the urgent, hidden life of the child she called Sparrow. The two were intertwined, a constant, living presence that filled the lonely cabin. When her own child kicked and turned within her, she would look down at the Apache baby cradled in her arms, and a profound, almost overwhelming sense of motherhood would wash over her. It was a fierce, dual loyalty that defied logic and law. She became an expert in deception. The cradleboard remained hidden, a totem of a life she could not acknowledge. She washed Sparrow's swaddling cloths at night, hanging them inside by the low light of the hearth so no passing rider would see them. Her ears were perpetually strained, listening for the sound of hoofbeats or the rumble of a wagon, ready to plunge the cabin into a convincing state of solitary life at a moment's notice. Sparrow began to thrive under her care. The hollows in his cheeks filled out, and his skin took on a healthy, burnished glow. He was a quiet baby, for the most part, his moments of distress brief and manageable. But it was the moments of connection that reshaped Eleanor's heart. There was the first time his tiny fingers closed purposefully around her own, his grip surprisingly strong. There was the morning he tracked the movement of a dust mote dancing in a sunbeam, his dark eyes wide with concentration. And then, one afternoon, as she hummed a tuneless lullaby, he looked directly into her eyes and smiled. It was not a grimace or a trick of the light. It was a genuine, gummy, breathtaking smile. In that instant, Eleanor's affection for him crystallized into a love so potent it frightened her. This was no longer an act of mercy. It was the core of her existence. Her knowledge of his origins grew not from words, but from objects. One evening, while mending a tear in the rabbit fur lining of his wrappings, her fingers found a small, hard object sewn into the seam. Carefully, she worked it free. It was a small amulet, a polished piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a hawk, tied with a leather thong. It was a thing of beauty and significance, clearly not a common trinket. It reinforced her certainty. This was the son of an important man. This was not a child abandoned, but a child lost. She imagined the chaos of an attack, a panicked flight, a mother desperately trying to hide her baby before falling. The story built itself in her mind, and with it, a deep, aching sympathy for the parents who had lost him. The outside world intruded on their fragile peace in the form of news, carried like a contagion by the few people she saw. Mr. Gable, stopping by to drop off the buttermilk Martha had promised, was full of grim tidings. "They're saying Teo's war party is 300 strong now," he said, leaning against the doorframe, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Not just Chiricahua. Mescalero are riding with him, too. They're united, and they're cutting a bloody swath all the way from the dragoons. The army's chasing its own tail." He shook his head, his face grim. "Something's got them spooked bad. They ain't just raiding for cattle and guns. They're searching, burning out homesteads, questioning folks, looking for something they lost." Eleanor's hands, hidden in the folds of her apron, turned to ice. 300 braves. Searching. A week later, the threat became even more tangible. The cavalry patrol passed by again, this time riding hard from the south. The young lieutenant, his face now gaunt and darkened by more than just the sun, reined in his horse only for a moment. His message was stark and devoid of pleasantries. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clipped and urgent, "we have confirmed intelligence. The Apache chief, Teo, his encampment was attacked by prospectors 2 months back. A clear violation of the treaty. In the chaos, his wife was killed and his infant son was lost. He believes the child was taken. He is tearing this territory apart, looking for him." The lieutenant leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. He's offering a reward to his own people for any information. And he's promising a slow death to whoever has the boy. They say he rides with his wife's scalp tied to his lance, a reminder of his vow. Ma'am, this isn't a war anymore. It's a man's personal vengeance. If you hear or see anything a white person trying to sell an Indian baby, anything you tell us. It's the only way this will end. He didn't wait for a reply, spurring his horse to catch up with his men, leaving Eleanor standing in a cloud of dust, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. His infant son. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The exquisite cradleboard, the turquoise hawk, the relentless, methodical search. She was hiding the son of the most feared man in the territory, a man driven by a grief so profound it had set the entire frontier ablaze. The love she felt for Sparrow was now shadowed by an equally powerful fear, not just for her own life, but for the life of the man who would come looking for him. She was caught between two worlds, a protector of a child who belonged to both and neither. That evening, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sun set, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red, the color of fire and blood. As darkness fell, Eleanor stood by the window, rocking Sparrow in her arms. She looked out at the vast, empty plains, but they no longer felt empty. They felt watchful. She scanned the dark line of the distant mesas, the shadowy expanse of the chaparral. And then she saw it, or thought she did, a flicker of movement on a far ridge. Too deliberate for a coyote, too still for a deer. It was there for a moment, a silhouette against the dying light, and then it was gone. An outrider, a scout. They were close. The vulture was beginning to circle. The feeling of being watched was no longer a product of her imagination. It was a palpable presence, a weight on the air itself. For 2 days, the lone rider on the ridge was a recurring specter, a silent sentinel marking the boundary of her world. He never approached, never made a threatening move. He simply observed, a dark statue against the skyline, a testament to the patient, inexorable nature of the coming storm. Eleanor's fear, once a sharp and jabbing thing, subsided into a dull, constant ache of dread. The time for hiding was over. A reckoning was at hand. On the third morning, she awoke to a new sight. The single rider was gone. In his place, on a series of low hills that formed a wide arc to the south, were more. 5, perhaps 6, spaced so far apart they were barely visible to the naked eye. They were not closing in, not yet. They were simply there, a tightening perimeter, a net being drawn around her small, vulnerable homestead. They were studying the land, her cabin, the plume of smoke from her chimney, the movements of her chickens in the yard. They were learning her life before they chose to end it. She knew then what she had to do. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Running was an impossibility. Her heavy body in the open terrain would make her an easy target. Hiding Sparrow when they finally came would be worse than useless. It would look like an admission of guilt, the act of a thief, not a rescuer. Her only chance, and his, lay in the truth. It was a fragile shield, but it was the only one she possessed. She had to face the father not as an adversary, but as another parent. A strange calm descended upon her. With the end in sight, her purpose became diamond hard. She would not meet this chief in fear and squalor. She would meet him with dignity. Her preparations were deliberate, almost ritualistic. She took the beaded cradleboard from its hiding place beneath the bed, wiping away the dust and polishing the smooth wood with a soft cloth until it gleamed. She laid it on the small table in the center of the room, a clear offering. Next, she turned to the child. She filled her largest basin with precious water, warming it over the fire. She unwrapped Sparrow from his simple cloths and bathed him gently, murmuring soft words as she cleaned every crease and fold of his small body. He gurgled and splashed, his dark eyes fixed on her face, trusting and unaware. She dried him with her best linen towel and looked through her meager possessions for something worthy of him. She settled on a soft, worn piece of her own cambric nightgown, tearing it into a clean, white swaddling cloth. Wrapped in it, he looked like a tiny prince. Finally, She prepared herself. She washed her own face and hands, the cool water a balm on her feverish skin. She unbraided her hair, brushing out the long, brown strands until they were smooth, then tying them back simply with a ribbon. She put on her Sunday dress, a dark blue calico that Thomas had bought for her on their wedding day. It was tight across her belly and shoulders now, but it was her finest garment, a symbol of her identity as a wife and a mother-to-be. Dressed and ready, she took Sparrow in her arms and stepped out onto the porch. The sun was beginning its slow descent, and the air was cooling. She sat in the rocking chair, her back straight, the baby held securely against her chest. She did not scan the horizon for threats. She simply waited. She rocked back and forth, the gentle creak of the wood the only sound, a steady rhythm against the pounding of her heart. She was a mother, waiting. Let the father come. The silence of the late afternoon was the first thing to break. It was not a sound at first, but a vibration in the soles of her feet, a low, subterranean tremor that grew steadily stronger. Then came a sound, a soft thunder that was not of the sky. Dust rose on the southern horizon, a great, roiling cloud of brown and gold, moving with a terrifying speed and purpose. Out of the dust they came. They were not a disorganized rabble, but a disciplined, flowing river of men and horses. They poured over the low hills, their lances catching the last rays of the sun, the lean, painted muscles of their ponies working effortlessly. There were not 30 or 100. There were hundreds, a sea of grim-faced warriors, their expressions unreadable, their presence an overwhelming force that seemed to suck the very air from the landscape. They did not ride directly at the cabin. Instead, the river of men split, flowing around it on both sides, until her small homestead was encircled by a silent, menacing ring of armed braves. The thunder of their arrival subsided into an unnerving quiet, punctuated only by the snorting of horses and the creak of leather. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The sheer scale of their power was absolute. She felt like a lone blade of grass in the path of a prairie fire. From the center of the line, one man rode forward. He was tall in the saddle, his seat easy and commanding. He wore simple buckskins, unadorned except for the eagle feathers in his long, dark hair. His face was a mask of hard angles and deep-set sorrows, his eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to scorch the distance between them. Tied to the tip of his lance, fluttering in the breeze, was a hank of dark hair. His wife's. This was Teo. This was the father. He reined in his war pony 20 yards from the porch, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her swollen belly, her clean dress, the rocking chair. Then his eyes locked on the bundle in her arms. Every warrior in the circle tensed. A low murmur went through their ranks. Bows were raised slightly, lances shifted to a readier grip. Eleanor's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Her arms tightened around Sparrow. This was the moment. All her resolve, all her desperate hope, balanced on the edge of a knife. The chief's face was unreadable, a stone carving of grief and rage. He dismounted in a single, fluid motion. He began to walk toward her, his steps deliberate, unhurried. The silence was so profound she could hear the crunch of his moccasins on the dry earth. Fear, cold and primal, threatened to paralyze her. Her mind screamed at her to run, to scream, to do anything but sit there, a helpless sacrifice. But she held her ground. She forced herself to meet his gaze. He stopped at the foot of the 3 short steps leading to her porch. He did not speak. He simply looked at the baby. His eyes, which had held the fire of 1,000 suns, seemed to hollow out, to fill with an agony so deep it was almost physical. Instead of cowering, Eleanor found a strength she did not know she possessed. Slowly, painstakingly, she stood up from the rocking chair. Her own child shifted inside her, a painful, reassuring weight. She took one step forward to the edge of the porch so he could see more clearly. She held Sparrow out, not as a shield or a hostage, but as an offering, an acknowledgement. He is yours. She could not speak his language, and he could not speak hers, but there was a language that passed between them, a language of parents. She spoke in English, her voice low and steady, not for the meaning of the words, but for the tone of reassurance. "I found him," she whispered. "His mother, she was gone. I kept him safe. I kept him warm." The chief's gaze flickered from the healthy, clean child to her own swollen form. He saw the tremble in her arms, the earnest terror in her eyes. He saw not a captor, but a protector. He saw a mother. His eyes fell upon the object on the table, just inside the cabin door, visible through the opening. The cradleboard. His son's cradleboard. He recognized the pattern of the quill work, the specific arrangement of the beads. His mother had made it. His wife had added to it. It was a map of their family's hopes. The stone facade of his face finally cracked. A tremor ran through his powerful frame. He took the last few steps and mounted the porch. He did not reach for the baby. Not yet. He walked past her to the table and gently, reverently, laid his hand upon the cradleboard. He closed his eyes for a long moment, a silent communion with all he had lost and all he had just found. When he turned back to her, the fire in his eyes had been banked. In its place was something that looked like weary, profound understanding. He looked at Sparrow, now cooing softly in Eleanor's arms, and for the first time, the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. It was a sad smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. He held out his arms. With infinite care, Eleanor transferred the warm, precious bundle from her arms to his. Teo held his son, holding him up to the sky for a moment, his voice rising in a single, powerful word that was both a prayer and a proclamation. The warriors around the cabin let out a collective sigh, a release of tension so audible it was like the wind passing through reeds. Lances were lowered. Bows were relaxed. The chief looked at Eleanor one last time. He reached to his own neck and removed a necklace, a simple leather thong strung with polished bear claws and a single, large piece of raw, blue turquoise. He pressed it into her hand, his calloused fingers briefly closing over hers. It was not payment. It was a gesture of honor, a life for a life, an acknowledgement of a debt that could never truly be repaid. He turned without another word, holding his son securely in the crook of one arm, and walked back to his horse. He mounted, raised the child once more for his men to see, and then, giving a sharp command, he led his warriors away. They did not disappear in a cloud of dust. They flowed back into the landscape as they had come, a silent, receding river, leaving behind only the tracks of their ponies and a silence that was no longer menacing, but full of a newfound peace. Eleanor stood on the porch, the chief's necklace clutched in her hand, until the last rider had vanished over the horizon. The sun had set, and the first stars were beginning to prick the deep violet of the twilight sky. The cabin behind her felt impossibly large and empty. The absence of Sparrow was a sudden, physical ache, a hollow space in her arms and in her heart. She sank back into the rocking chair, her body trembling with the aftermath of a terror and grace so immense she could hardly comprehend it. She looked at the gift in her palm. The bear claws were smooth and cool, the turquoise a piece of the sky. It was a talisman of a promise kept, a bridge between two worlds that had met in her own front yard. A sharp kick from within her own womb brought her back to herself. She laid a hand on her belly, a wave of profound relief and exhaustion washing over her. She had faced down 300 warriors and their grieving chief. She had protected one child and would soon welcome another. She was no longer just Eleanor Miller, a lonely settler's wife waiting for her husband to return. She was a woman who had stood her ground, who had listened to her heart instead of her fear. She went back inside the cabin. The silence was different now. It was not the silence of loneliness, but of solitude. The air still held the faint, sweet scent of the baby. She looked at the empty space on her bed, then at the cradleboard still resting on the table, which the chief had left behind, a gift for the child that was to come. She sat for a long time in the gathering dark, her fingers tracing the intricate beadwork. It was a place of terrible beauty and sorrow, but also a place of unexpected connection, a place where the language of a mother's love could be understood without a single word. She was safe. She was stronger than she had ever known, and she was ready. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.